Good morning, everyone. In the last class, we discussed about how to develop a REST API to perform CRUD operations. So here we used MySQL database, which is available in our local system, and we implemented this application, right? In this REST API, we have used 4 types of requests. We used get request method, we used post request method, we used put request method, and we used the delete request method. Fine. So we have developed this application and we tested this application by using Postman. We tested this application by using Postman. So here, this application is implemented by using layered architecture. So we are having web layer nothing but where we developed our REST controllers. Web layer is available, and we have service layer where we do our business logic implementation, and we have repository layer which is used to communicate with the database, So in the yesterday session, we developed and we tested application working as expected. Now, I want to add Swagger documentation for this project. So already we discussed about what is Swagger. I have given you a video also related to Swagger. Swagger is used to generate documentation for REST API. Swagger UI is used to test REST API with user interface. Now, so let me go with this Swagger form.xml. Let me add Swagger documentation. Form.xml, let me add the Swagger documentation dependencies. So we need to add the 2 dependencies to work with the Swagger, guys. So we need to work with 2 dependencies. So one is the Swagger, another one is the Swagger UI. So I'm going to give those here. Swagger UI. These are the 2 dependencies we are adding for Swagger. Go to pom.xml, add these 2 dependencies. So one is a Swagger 2 dependency, another one is a Swagger UI dependency I'm adding. All right. So let's update our Maven project. Maven, update the project so that it will download all the latest dependencies. Fine. Next, run this application, run as boot application. I just added Swagger dependencies in the pom.xml. Let us see. Yeah, application started. Just Swagger dependencies added, but to generate the documentation, that Swagger configuration class is not created. We need to create one configuration class to tell the Swagger for which classes it has to generate the documentation. In our project, there are several packages available and several classes available. For which packages this Swagger has to generate the documentation. Swagger should generate the documentation for all the classes available in the project. Swagger should generate the documentation only for the REST controllers in the project. Guys, Swagger should generate the documentation for all the classes, or it should generate the documentation only for the REST controllers. So we need to provide that information to Swagger. For that, I'm going to create one class called Swagger config. I'm creating one class called Swagger config. So what is this Swagger config? This Swagger config is used to provide the information to the Swagger for which classes it has to generate the documentation. To represent this class as a configuration class, we will use @configuration annotation, and we will use enable Swagger. I want to represent this class as a configuration class, and I want to enable Swagger. So this is my Swagger configuration class. In this Swagger configuration class, we are going to write the logic to give the information for which class it has to generate the documentation. We are going to write the logic for which class it has to generate the documentation. So in our application, there are multiple classes are available. So in those classes, for which classes this documentation should be generated, it is not for all. We need to generate the documentation for particular package classes only. For that, we need to write a logic here to provide the instruction to the Swagger to generate the documentation for only REST controller package. For that, we are going to use public docket API doc. Public docket API doc. Return new docket object, documentation type dot swagger2, documentation type dot swagger2 dot select dot APIs. In the APIs, request handler selectors dot base packages. Our base package is in.ashokit.rest dot path selectors dot any dot build. So this is going to generate the documentation for our REST API. It is going to generate the documentation for our REST API. Are you guys clear with my point? So here I'm creating one class. The class name is Swagger config. So to represent this class as a configuration class, I'm writing @configuration annotation, and I want to use this as a Swagger. So I'm writing enable Swagger to annotation. Here I'm creating docket object. Docket is a predefined class available in the Swagger. So this docket object represents configuration that should be generated for the classes. So I want to represent this as a Spring Bean so that IOC container will call this method, right? So I'm writing a configuration class. I'm writing a bean annotation. So when we are discussing about annotations in the Spring, I explained what is component, what is service, what is repository, what is configuration, what is bean. So a Java class to represent as a configuration class, we are going to use @configuration annotation. To represent Java class as a configuration class, we are using @configuration annotation. So this class is for working with the Swagger. So I want to enable the Swagger. And here I'm writing a method. Method name can be anything. I'm writing method name as a API doc. Right after that, I'm writing @bean annotation. Docket. Return new docket. Select APIs. Request handler selectors dot base package in.ashokit.rest. So here, for which package classes it has to generate the documentation, I'm giving that information. My APIs are available. My REST controllers are available in this package. Paths, that means within the REST controller, for which path related classes you want to generate the documentation. I don't want to give any particular path. I want to generate the documentation for any path in those package classes. Path selectors dot any. There is no restriction. For all the classes available in this package. I want to generate the documentation. Path selectors dot any dot build, generate the documentation. So this is Swagger configuration class. I have added Swagger dependencies and I have created Swagger configuration class. Now Let's run our application, refresh, run as boot application, run as boot application. See how this project is going to execute now. How this project is going to execute now. So there is a problem. It is failing. It is failing. Null pointer exception. Failed to start the documentation plugin. Bootstrapper. Nested exception is null pointer exception. Failed to start. Let me check this in the Google. Is there any issue with the Swagger latest versions that we are using? The issue is caused for Spring Fox 3.0, not supporting new path pattern based matching, which is now the default from Spring Boot 2.6.0. Spring Boot 2.5.2 version solved my issue. They are saying that. Change Spring to use AND matchers with configuring it in application.properties. Let's add this property. Let's try. Application.properties. Right click, run as boot application. Let us see. Or else I will downgrade the boot version to 2.5.2 if it is not working. Yeah, now it is working perfectly. Fine. So here, whenever we add this Swagger, we are writing one property to tell the Spring to use this AND match pattern and path matcher, because here I'm specifying that path selectors that any. So we need to write this property. Spring spring.mbc dot path match dot matching strategy is equal to and path matcher. That's fine. So we are able to start our boot application. Here, our application is running on the port number 8080. Swagger documentation is having a URL pattern /v2/API docs. One custom documentation plugin is available in the build path. I have added Swagger, right? That is a documentation plugin. That is a third-party plugin. As I have added, it is displaying in the console clearly. One documentation plugin is added in our application. Now, how to access this documentation of Swagger? Okay, let's go to browser. Let's go to browser. Localhost colon 8080/v2/API docs. It will give you complete project documentation in the JSON format. It will give you project documentation in the JSON format. By using /v2/API docs, you can access this documentation. If you want to see the UI, we have added Swagger as well as a Swagger UI in the pom.xml. Swagger is available. Swagger UI also available in the pom.xml. So what is this Swagger UI? Swagger UI is used to test our application. 8080/swagger-ui.html. Now see here, one user interface is displaying. So Swagger is providing a user interface. Using this user interface, you can test the Swagger. Guys, testing with the Postman, you need to have complete idea about your API. But when you go for Swagger, Swagger only displaying what methods are available, what URL patterns are there, they are binded to which request. Go to get. Now here I want to test this get request method. Click on try it out, click on execute. You see it is giving all the books data. 4 books are available. Suppose if you want to add a book, post request, click on try it out, book ID. We no need to send the book ID in the request because book ID is a primary key. Book name, I'm giving it as React.js. Book price, I'm giving as 200. Click on execute. The book is added successfully. Book inserted. Now go to /books. See the React.js book is displaying or not. Click on execute. Now you see the React.js book is also coming.
You understand my point? This Swagger UI is providing user interface to test our REST API. Swagger UI is providing user interface to test our REST API. So what data we need to send in the request, what data we are going to get in the output, everything will be displayed in the Swagger UI. Everything will be displayed in the Swagger UI. But if you go for Postman, will it tell you what input you need to send, what output you are going to get? When you go for Postman, will it tell you what input you are going to send, what input you have to send, what output it is going to provide? Will it tell you that information? Will it tell you that information, guys? In the Postman, it will not tell you. But in the Swagger UI is available, which will provide the documentation for you. Which will provide documentation for you. Are you able to understand my point? Are you able to understand my point? How to access this Swagger UI? Now here, once these details are added, now we can access Swagger UI using below URL, this URL. We can access Swagger documentation using below URL. We can access Swagger documentation using below URL /v2/API docs /v2/API docs. If you are getting some problem with the documentation plugin, add the below property in application.properties file. Add below property in application.properties file so that this issue will not come. So Swagger is used to generate the documentation for REST API. Swagger UI is used to test REST API with the user interface. So now this is the Swagger video. Add the below dependencies in pom.xml. Add below two dependencies in pom.xml file. I'm adding these two dependencies in pom.xml file. Dependency Swagger dependency, Swagger UI dependency. Once these dependencies are added, we need to add this property. Otherwise, you are getting an error. So that is ant match pattern property. We are telling to select the paths of our REST controller to generate the documentation. Once it is added, then run the application. Then you can access the application documentation using this URL. This is the documentation URL. This is the Swagger UI URL. So this is my Swagger configuration class. This is my Swagger configuration class. Create Swagger configuration class like below. Create Swagger config class like below. This is my Swagger configuration class. Then run the application and access Swagger documentation with this URL, this URL. Swagger UI is very advanced concept, guys. It will show you what functionality is available in your REST API, what methods are available, and what is the URL patterns, what is input data, what is output data. It will show you very clearly. It will show you very clearly. So did you practice? Did you practice Swagger? All of you? Did you practice Swagger? Did you practice Swagger? Yes, right? Very good. So with this, we understood what is a Swagger, how to work with the Swagger. Could you please read these points once? How we are working with the Swagger? Swagger is used to generate documentation for REST APIs. Swagger UI is used to test REST API with user interface. Add below two dependencies in the pom.xml to work with the Swagger, dependency 1 and dependency 2. Add the below property in the properties file. If you are getting some exception with that, some latest versions of the Swagger having the issue with the path selector, to resolve that issue, we are going to specify yant path matcher property there. Once it is done, we need to create a Swagger configuration class to tell where the classes are available in our project to generate the documentation. That one we are creating by using docket object. That one we are creating by using docket object. Return new docket. Documentation type is a Swagger. Select it. APIs. My APIs are available in this package, REST controller package. In this API, for all methods, path can be anything. Path selectors.any. In that REST controller, for all path related methods, I want to generate the documentation. Then build, generate that. Once this class is ready, run the application, Swagger will be started. Swagger UI you can access here to test our REST API. We can access a Swagger documentation also using this below URL. If you go for UI, very clearly it is giving options to test your APIs. So you can send this JSON data. They will tell you the input they are expecting this data. When you go for other method delete method, you see it is clearly showing book ID. Book ID expecting as a path variable. When you go for put request, it is showing that it is expecting these three fields in the request body to send a put request. So what data you need to send, what data you are going to get, everything is displaying in the UI. Everything it is explaining in the UI also. All right. All right. So this is related to how to work with the Swagger and how to test the API from the Swagger and how to generate the documentation by using Swagger. All right, guys. Swagger is a very simple concept, just adding a dependency, creating the configuration class, and accessing the documentation and accessing the UI for testing purpose. That's it. And some annotations also available for the Swagger. So we are going to write some annotations, API operation, API model, API property, like that. Some annotations will be available to provide more information about our APIs. So what is this method? This method is one operation, right? So we will represent that as the API operation. So this is a API REST controller. We will write some Swagger annotations here. So in that video, I have explained what are the annotations we are going to use. Those annotations are only for improving that documentation, providing more information about the REST API. To provide more information about the REST API, we are going to use those annotations, Swagger annotations, API, API operation, API property, API request, API response, like that. Some annotations are there. In the video, I have explained those annotations as well. Right. So some people will work with Postman and some people will work with the Swagger in the companies. Swagger is advanced. Swagger is advanced, right? So because when you go for Postman, Postman will not tell you what input data you need to send, what output data you need to get, and what methods are available in the API. Postman will not give you that information. Swagger will give you the information about the API. So tomorrow we are developing our REST API. How other company can understand what methods are available, what input we are expecting, what output we are providing, generally where we will use this Postman and Swagger. So this is my REST API. This is my REST API. So when I develop this REST API, I know what input it takes, what output it provides. To test this REST API, I will use Postman because I am the developer of the API. What input that API is taking, what output that API will provide, I know that information. Then I can use the Postman to test the API. Okay, that is fine. But tomorrow, some company want to access our REST API. There is a client application. Today we developed API. Today we developed API. That API we are testing using Postman because we know what methods are available in the API, what is input data we need to send, what is output data we are going to get. I know the complete information of my API. When you know the complete information of the API, in order to test that API, we are using Postman. For tomorrow, this client application now, this REST API developed by TCS company. This client application is developing by Infosys company. How Infosys people will understand what methods are available in the REST API, what are the URL patterns, what methods are available in the REST API, what is the URL pattern, what is input data, what is output data of the REST API. For them, we are going to provide Swagger documentation to understand our API. Able to follow my point? Able to follow my point? Swagger doc, right? Because this project is developed by TCS company. TCS developers knows what is there in this API, what methods are there in this API, how to test this API. But tomorrow, our application is acting as a provider application. Our application is a provider application. We developed API. This Infosys application is acting as a consumer application. So consumer want to access our provider. How consumer can access our provider? If a consumer knows the details of the provider, then only consumer can access the provider. In the video, I have explained this topic only. We developed one REST API in our company. Other company people want to access our REST API. If other people want to access our REST API, they should know what is our REST API, what functionality available in the REST API, what methods available in the REST API, what URL patterns available in the REST API, how we are going to provide the data to our client application team to develop a logic to access our API. For our API, we are adding Swagger documentation. Now, I have added a Swagger documentation. I will give this Swagger documentation URL to Infosys team. Then Infosys team will go through this Swagger documentation, will understand, okay, in the REST controller, 4 methods are available. First method is binded to post request, /book is the URL. In this method, they are expecting data in the JSON format. They are going to take the data in the JSON format. Okay, they are going to provide the response in the text format. See here, input format is JSON, input parameter content type is JSON, response content type is star, nothing but a text, nothing but a text. Next one, go to put method. Put method also expecting input in the JSON. This is JSON data they're expecting. Response coming in the text format. Delete method. Delete method is expecting data in the URL as a path variable directly. Response type is a star, nothing but text pattern. /books get request. Here there is no input. There is no input. Only response is there. Response content will come. So whenever you click on, response will come in this format. So that complete information about the API is available in the Swagger. So now, if I give my project Swagger URL to the Infosys team, can they understand what is there in my application? If I give my Swagger documentation to Infosys team, can they understand how to access my REST API? So what is the main purpose of going for REST APIs? The main purpose of developing the REST APIs for distributed application development, right? B2B communication, B2B communication. So we are developing API, somebody will access our API. So how they can access our API? If they know the details of our API, they are going to access it. So now, sir, are we going to use only Swagger? Are we going to use only Postman? No, we will use both. So where we will use Postman? When you develop your REST API to test your REST API, you will use Postman because you know the input, you know output. You know method URL pattern, what input, what output. For a testing purpose, you will use Postman to test the behavior, for testing, test. Postman, we are going to use for testing our REST API. Then why we are using Swagger documentation for our API? Why we will use Swagger documentation? Our client is developing by some other company, provider we developed, client is developing by other company. So how this Infosys development team will understand what information available in this REST API, what methods are available, what URL patterns are available, what is input, what is output, that we are providing in the documentation. We are providing the documentation of the REST API. What the documentation contains? What the documentation contains? Information. So if you go to this is the JSON. This JSON contains all the information about our REST API. What methods are available? What are the URL patterns? What is the input? What is the output? Everything. Client, whatever the information required for the client to access the API, that information we are providing by using Swagger. Now you understand the difference between Swagger doc and Postman. Postman will be used for unit testing purpose. Swagger is used to provide the documentation for our client applications so that they can understand our application. They can understand the services providing by our application. They can access those services. Is this clear? Is this clear for all of you? Please respond, guys. Is this clear? How to work with the Swagger in the REST API? How to work with the Swagger in the REST API? We can access a Swagger UI using this Swagger documentation using this URL. Now I have added Swagger. Client-side development team will understand the API details using Swagger. Client-side development team will understand REST API details using Swagger documentation. Will understand the API details using Swagger documentation. Client-side development team will understand API details using Swagger documentation. So what information this Swagger documentation will provide? Swagger documentation will provide methods, URL patterns, input data, output data. Swagger doc provides operations. Operations nothing but methods, URL patterns, input request data, and response data of the REST API. So what are the methods available in the REST API? Methods nothing but operations, API operations. So get method, get operation, post method, post operation. What operations are available in the API? Those operations will be provided. And for those operations, what are the URL patterns available? URL patterns will be provided. Request data and response data also will be provided. Request data and response data also will be provided by Swagger. Client will understand our API using this Swagger documentation only. Not only our client side. Suppose, for example, in our application, front end is developing by one team, back end is developing by one team. How front end team can access our back end API? By using Swagger documentation, they will understand. For every API, we need to add the Swagger. In our project, microservices architecture, there are 10 APIs available. For 10 APIs, we need to provide the Swagger documentation. Now, suppose backend is developing by one team, front end is developing by another team. Okay, backend development team is developing the REST APIs using Spring Boot. Front end team is developing the UI using Angular. So this Angular team should access our REST API. How the Angular team will understand what methods are available in the REST API, what is the URL pattern, what is request data, what is response data, how the Angular team, I mean to say front-end team will understand about our API. Front-end team also require documentation. So we will provide the Swagger documentation for the UI team. So UI people will understand our API with the documentation. Based on that, they will develop the front-end logic to access our REST API. Are you guys able to understand my point? You understand the importance of the Swagger? So if our API, we are developing microservices architecture. APIs will be separate projects, UI will be a separate project. API will be a separate project, UI will be a separate project. So if front end is developing by one team, back end is developing by other team. Now assume that we are the back end developers. So we developed a REST API. Front end developer should access our REST API. Angular application should access our REST API. How the Angular developer will understand what data I am expecting, what data I will provide, what is my URL pattern of my API. Everything they will get from the documentation. Consumer application, consumer may be a separate application, or consumer may be our UI application. Consumer may be our friend, so some third party company application, or consumer may be our company UI application. So UI developer should get the information about the API to access. Full stack development, back end by using Spring Boot, front end by using Angular. Angular is developing by one team and Spring Boot project developing by other team. Angular developers should access our REST API using HTTP client module. So they should know the API details. So this API contains how many operations, what are the URL patterns, what is input, what is output. They need that information, then only they can develop that user interface logic to access our backend API. Are you clear with my point? Why we are using Swagger? Swagger is providing documentation about the REST API. So whoever want to access our API, they should know API data, API operations, API URL patterns, API request data, API response data. So they should know these details to access. Those details we are providing by using Swagger. So how to add the Swagger documentation? I gave the steps clearly. So you need to add these two dependencies and add this property in the properties file, create the Swagger configuration class. That's it. 3 changes you need to do. Adding the dependencies, adding the property, creating the configuration class. This configuration class represents for which classes we have to generate the documentation. We are not going to generate the documentation for all the classes. Documentation should be generated only for REST controllers. Okay, once it is done, we can access the UI to test. Swagger UI is available to test it. This is the URL. So Swagger documentation is available in the JSON. This is the URL. So for client side team or for UI team, we will give these URLs so that they can access the documentation. Based on the documentation, they will develop their logic, client logic to access our REST API. Okay, in future, our application only will have a UI. Our UI project is there. Then this UI project also going to access this REST API. Third party people accessing our REST API and the UI application is going to access this REST API. Third party people will access our REST API and UI people also will access our REST API. UI is one project, REST API is one project. REST API is a backend application, UI is a front-end application. So I developed this REST API. I will test that REST API using Postman. Then documentation I will provide for UI team to understand the API so that they can develop Angular logic to access this. Third party Infosys people also want to access our REST API. For Infosys people, I will provide Swagger documentation. They will understand the API, they will develop the client logic. Got my point? So in the project, all the REST controllers we are going to create in one package and we are going to specify that base package. Good. Basically, we are going to create microservices, right? One microservice contains only one REST controller, guys. One microservice contains only one REST controller in the projects. One microservice is responsible for only one functionality. One microservice is responsible for only one functionality. All right, good. I'm sharing this screenshot. Guys, I don't know how many of you practicing on daily basis. If you don't practice, there is no use of attending the classes. If you don't practice, there is no use of attending the classes. By this week, mostly our REST API will complete. Then the most important part, microservices will start. If you don't have the clarity on these RESTful services, you cannot understand the microservices. All right. Microservices means, again, we are going to develop the REST APIs only with some cloud concepts. Spring Cloud concepts we are going to use. So you should be very clear with the REST APIs development. You understood the difference between Postman and Swagger? You understood the difference between Postman and Swagger? Very good. Fine, guys. Next one. The next concept is how to work with embedded databases. We have embedded server. We have embedded server. Embedded server means whenever you develop a boot application with web starter, server is coming by default. Spring Boot is giving a server also to run our application. Spring Boot is giving server also to run our application. Similarly, we can go for embedded databases. Embedded database is a temporary database. Embedded database. Embedded databases are temporary databases. Embedded databases will come along with the application and will die when application got stopped. Embedded databases are used for unit testing purpose and for practice purpose. Embedded databases are used for unit testing and for POC development. Is used for POC development, proof of concept. Proof of concept. We no need to download and install embedded databases. We no need to download and install embedded databases. Embedded databases will come along with the application. Embedded databases will come along with the application. When we start the application, then embedded DB will start, and when we stop the application, then embedded database will be stopped. Data is not permanent. Data is not permanent in the embedded database. Data is not permanent in the embedded database. Okay, now I want to develop one small functionality as a POC. POC stands for proof of concept. proof of concept. That means, so if you want to learn something by using database communication, so you no need to waste your time to download the database and to install the database. Database, ready-made database is available. For example, we are using MySQL. What we have done, we downloaded the MySQL database server, we downloaded MySQL workbench, MySQL database I installed in my system, and I'm connecting with MySQL database. So tomorrow in your company will give you one laptop. Can you install MySQL database in your laptop? Can you install MySQL database in your laptop? Can you install Oracle database in your laptop, in the company given laptop? So company will not allow you to install any software without permission. Okay? Then how can you learn a concept with DB communication? That's where embedded databases comes into picture. Embedded databases are temporary databases, are also called as in-memory databases. Embedded databases are temporary databases, are also called as in-memory databases. Embedded databases are used for POC development, proof of concept. Embedded databases are used for POC development. These are for proof of concept. We no need to download and install embedded databases. We no need to download and install embedded databases. Embedded databases will come along with our application by adding one dependency. By adding one dependency. When we start application, then embedded DB will start, and when we stop the application, embedded DB will be stopped. Data is not permanent in the embedded DB. When we stop application, we will lose the data. When we stop the application, we will lose the data. We will lose the data. Embedded databases are used only for practice purpose and unit testing purpose, not for the production purpose. We cannot use embedded databases for sit environment, prod environment like that. Embedded databases we need to use only for our practice purpose, only for using temporarily. I need a database only for half an hour. When my project is executing, then only I need the database. When my project is stopped, I don't need the database. Okay, embedded databases are temporary databases, or they are also called as in-memory databases. Embedded databases are temporary databases, and they are also called as in-memory databases. Embedded databases are used for POC development. I mean to say proof of concept. So anything you want to learn in the company with some CRUD operations you want to perform using Spring Boot, then you can do that by using embedded database, because you don't need the data after some time. When the application is executing, then only we need the data. So if you want to work with these kind of temporary databases, you no need to download and install any database. These databases will come along with your application by adding one dependency. When we start the application, database will start. When we stop the application, database will be stopped. Data is not permanent in the embedded DB. When we stop the application, we will lose it. It is not, it is embedded DB or in-memory DBs. In-memory DBs are not used for, not used for, not used for prod, sit, UAT, prod, not used for sit, UAT, prod environments in the company. We will use only for our unit testing purpose, our develop local purpose. Anything that you want to learn, you want a database immediately, then go for H2 database. Can you read these points, all of you? All of you, can you read these points? What is embedded database? Are you guys clear with this? What is embedded database? When we need to go for embedded database, guys? When we need to go for embedded database? Are we going to use that in the real-time project? Are we going to use embedded database in the real-time project? Then when we will go for embedded database? When we will go for embedded database? Practice purpose, learning purpose, POC purpose, unit testing purpose. Embedded databases are also called as in-memory databases. So let us see in the Google what they are telling about embedded databases. Embedded database. Embedded database is a database technology in which database management solutions are built into an application rather than provided as a standalone tools. Right? Embedded database system is a database management system which is tightly integrated with the application software. It is embedded within the application. So they will come along with your application. You no need to download and you no need to install anything. A ready-made database will be available for you. We can use H2 database. We can use H2 DB. We can use HTDB as an in-memory DB. In-memory DB for practice. Now, so here we have MySQL DB, REST API CRUD operations with MySQL DB. Suppose if you are having an office laptop, you can't install the MySQL software or you can't install the Oracle software. Then how can you practice this CRUD operations? By using H2. You can use H2 database. Now let me go to this project. Let me change this project. 37 application. Just I will change the database details. That's it. 37 REST API CRUD H2 application. Click on this. I'm copying this project, guys. 36 project, 37 project, both are same. The only difference, 36 application using local MySQL database. 36 application using my local MySQL application. 37 application, I am going to use H2 database. Now, first we need to make a change in the pom.xml. Now, currently we are using MySQL connector. Where is that MySQL connector? Starter data GPI. Yeah, here MySQL connector is available, which is used to communicate with MySQL database. Now, I don't need the MySQL. I need a H2. Go to mvnrepository.com, search for H2 dependency. mvnrepository.com, search for H2 dependency, H2 embedded database, group ID, artifact ID, version. Take this. Remove the MySQL. Remove MySQL dependency. Add H2 dependency. Add the H2 dependency. No need to add the version. I'm adding H2. Group ID, com.h2 database, artifact ID is H2. What about the database properties? Database username, database, all these things, right? So database username, you can give anything. Password also you can give anything. org.h2.driver. What is the driver we need to give now? org.h2.driver. org.h2.driver. URL jdbc colon h2 colon mem colon testdb. I'm giving like this URL jdbc colon h2 colon mem colon testdb, jdbc colon mem colon h2 colon, I think so, jdbc colon mem colon h2 colon testdb. Testdb is the database name. Username is sa, password is sa. Password username you can give anything. Driver class name is h2 driver. Driver class name is h2 driver. Now in my project I added h2 dependency. In my project I'm adding H2 dependency. All right. Then data source properties. I removed MySQL data source properties. I'm adding H2 database properties. All right. Let's run our application. Refresh. It is a H2 app. Refresh. Run as boot application. Run as boot application. It failed. I think the URL is incorrect. 1 second. Properties JDBC colon H2 colon mem colon testdb. JDBC colon H2 colon mem colon testdb. Refresh. Run as boot app. Yeah. Now application started with H2. So see here they are telling H2 console is available at /H2 console URL pattern. Now go to browser localhost colon 8080 / H2 console. See here, beautiful. I'm able to access my H2. So what is the database properties? What are the database properties I have given? This is my URL. Give that URL here. Give that URL. Whatever the URL you configure in this properties file, same URL you need to give here. Username SA, password is also SA, test connection, test successful, password, click on connect. I'm able to connect with my database. This is my temporary database. Click on the table name, run this. Do we have any records in the table? No. In the database, we don't have any record. Let me insert one record by using Swagger documentation, UI, post, try it out. Book ID, I am no need to send it. Book name, I'm giving as JPA, price is 100, execute. I have sent the request, go to database, run this, one record is inserted. Can you see one record is inserted in the H2 database? Now, if I stop my application, database will go. I stopped my application. When I stop my application, can you access the database? Can we access our database? No, we cannot access our database. This site cannot be reached. Database is gone. If your application is started, then only database will come. Run as boot application. Run as boot application. Got it. If application is started, then database is coming. Now go to SA connect. See, previously inserted record is not available because this H2 is a temporary database. H2 is a temporary database. So previous data is available or previous data is not available. Previous data is available or previous data is not available. Previously I inserted a JPA record. Do I have that JPA record here or the JPA record is not available? Not available. Why that record is not available? Why the record is not available? Application stopped. So database gone. Once I start my application, again database got created. So these are data source properties. Add below dependency in pom.xml. Add below dependency in pom.xml to work with the H2. Add H2 data source properties like below. Configure H2 data source properties. Configure H2 data source properties. Run the application and access H2 console using below URL. What is that URL? http://localhost:/ your application port. My port number is 8080 /H2 console /H2 console. So here we are using, instead of we used one application with MySQL. MySQL is a permanent database. Data will be stored into the MySQL database permanently. So today, if you store the data, After 10 years also data will be available in the MySQL. MySQL is a permanent database. Oracle is also a permanent database. But here I want to use a database for temporary. I want the database for temporary purpose. That's it. So to work with the temporary databases, there is a concept called embedded database. Embedded database is also called as in-memory database. Embedded database is also called as in-memory database. Embedded databases are used for POC development. They are nothing but proof of concept. I want to learn one concept by developing one application. That is called POC. Learn a concept by developing one application, POC. So we no need to download and install embedded databases to use in our project. Got it? Embedded databases will come along with our application by adding one dependency. Embedded database will come along with our application by adding one dependency. When we start application, then embedded DB will start, and when we stop the application, then embedded DB will be stopped. When we start the application, then embedded DB will start. When we stop the application, then embedded DB will be stopped. Data is not permanent in the embedded DB. When we stop the application, we will lose the data. In-memory DBs are not used for real-time project development in the company. We can use H2DB as an in-memory DB for practice purpose. Just how to use this H2DB in the project? Add this dependency in the pom.xml. Configure these data source properties. Username, password, you can give anything, right? URL, this URL you need to give, and this is the driver class name. So once your application is started, how to access this embedded database console? You can use this URL. H2 console is the URL pattern. Localhost colon 8080/h2 console. org.h2.driver. Guys, make sure what are the details you configure in the data source properties. Using those properties, you can connect here. My driver class name org.h2.driver. My JDBC URL, whatever I have given in this properties file, same URL I am giving here. My username is SA, my password is SA. Click on connect. I'm able to connect. Then click on table name, click on run. It is displaying table data. Currently no data is available. You can insert the data from the application. Now click on execute. One record is inserted. Go here and check it, run. One record is inserted. If I stop my application, I will lose my data. If I stop my application, I will lose my data. So this embedded database is in-memory database, which is used for temporary purpose. Samjha? You understand what is the purpose of going for embedded database? Fine, guys. Tomorrow, I'm going to show you how to deploy our REST APIs in the cloud, Heroku cloud. Currently, we developed the REST API and we are accessing the REST API within our machine by using localhost. But tomorrow, I am going to show you how to deploy our REST API in the Heroku cloud platform. Guys, all of you, before coming to tomorrow's session, create one account in the Heroku cloud. Heroku is a Salesforce cloud. We can deploy our application, our REST API in the Heroku cloud so that everybody can access our REST API. Everybody can access our REST API. Currently, our REST API is accessing only within our system. Now, I want this REST API to be accessed by everybody. For that, we need to use this Heroku cloud. Okay, already how to deploy the application, Spring Boot application in the AWS cloud. I already prepared one video and I have shared that. Okay, so in the tomorrow session, I will show you how to deploy our application in the Heroku cloud, in the cloud platform. Why we are going to deploy in the Heroku cloud? Currently, our APIs are running in the local. Only within our system we can access with local host. How my API will be accessed by everybody in the public? That application should be deployed into some cloud server. I'm going to use Heroku Cloud tomorrow to deploy our application. So to deploy the application into Heroku Cloud, you need to have the account in the Heroku. So before coming to tomorrow's session, create the account in the Heroku Cloud so that I will tell you the deployment process into Heroku Cloud. So this is sign up heroku.login. It is a free account, guys. Free account, create the platform, deploy now. You can deploy our application into Heroku for free of cost. So create the account in the Heroku before coming to tomorrow session. Okay. Create account in Heroku Cloud. Create account in the Heroku Cloud. So that tomorrow I will show you REST API deployment in the cloud platform. Clear for everybody? I'm going to upload the class notes. Otherwise, I will forget that. So today we understood how to work with the Swagger and how to work with H2 database. And tomorrow we are going to work with cloud deployment. Okay. Notes uploaded, guys. So please check it. Notes uploaded. Could you please check it? Is the latest notes reflecting for you? Is the latest notes reflecting for you? Could you please check it, guys? Please confirm in the chat now itself. Is the latest notes reflecting for you? Yeah, Mr. Bipin Singh, you can remove the MySQL dependency. You can add only H2. I have done the same thing. I have removed MySQL dependency from my form.xml and I have added only H2 dependency because we are not using MySQL database. We are not using MySQL properties. I removed MySQL dependency. I added only H2 dependency. I added only H2 dependency. Got it? Perfect. Perfect. You got the notes for today? Latest notes is displaying for you guys. Yeah, latest notes is available. So practice. This is Swagger. Swagger notes also I have updated. Na? What are the dependencies for the Swagger? Swagger configuration class, Swagger URLs, and working with the embedded database dependency, data source properties, access the DB console. Got it. So please practice these things before coming to tomorrow and create the account in the Heroku also. Tomorrow I will show you how to deploy our REST API into cloud platform. REST API into cloud platform. Okay, fine. Thank you guys. See you tomorrow. Bye bye. Have a great day, guys. Sanjay Rastogi. So I will set up a meeting tomorrow for the doubts clarifications in the tomorrow afternoon. Meanwhile, if your Lombok is not working, you can use setters getters tomorrow at 12 o'clock. There is a meeting with students who are having the doubts. I will share the link for you. Tomorrow afternoon, you can join. Yeah. Okay. Fine, guys. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.